Joining me now on set is Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Symone Sanders-Townsend, former senior advisor to Vice President Harris and host of Symone on MSNBC. And Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch and an NBC News political analyst. Thanks to all of you for being here. Tia, pick up where Steve left off. This announcement by Joe Manchin that he is not running for re-election, causing jitters within the Democratic Party about holding on to control of the Senate and, of course, the White House.
Right. He's actually in Georgia today, speaking at the University of Georgia about bipartisanship in the spirit of former Senator Johnny Isakson. But he's making it clear he is leaving the door open for a potential third-party run at president. He's talking about this next chapter focused on bipartisanship, governing from the center. Now, the question is that what voters really want? Like, at the end of the day, voters say they want alternatives, but a lot of times when it gets down to actually choosing, they stick with one of the two major parties. But is it enough to be a spoiler? Yes. Is it enough to actually win? No Label says they can, but the evidence in the history says that's not really the case.
Yeah, and Symone, I mean, Senator Manchin knows that. He knows the history and how tough a path a third-party candidate would have. We've not seen a third-party candidate be successful in recent history. But give us the buzz from within the Democratic Party. How much concern is there about this announcement by Senator Manchin?
I think there's a lot of concern, but the concern about Senator Manchin, I think, is primarily about Democrats in the Senate and less about the no labels piece. Because while I think outwardly Joe Manchin has been talked about as a potential for no labels, I think realistically there may be some other people that will actually probably end up on that docket and not Senator Manchin. But the Senate is a real problem. That's a real issue for Democrats. Joe Manchin, I know I've heard folks all day long say, well, he wasn't going to win re-election. If anybody could win re-election, it was Joe Manchin. I don't know another Democrat in West Virginia that can win statewide in that Senate seat. So where are the pickup opportunities, as we just discussed? Potentially Colin Allred in Texas, maybe. He's someone that Republican operatives in the state have said, I think he could make a dent, but the Senate is a real issue. And if the president is reelected without a Democratic Senate, there is no finishing the job.
That's actually a very good point. What that would look like, actual divided government. Stephen, let me bring you into this. President Biden got some very mixed news this week. On the one hand, you had the Democratic wins on Tuesday night, fueled by abortion. On the other hand, really tough poll numbers, which showed former President Trump beating him in 5 key battleground states. His age is a big concern for voters. President Biden made a joke about it at a recent event. I want to play it and get your reaction on the other side.
I honestly say, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, I've never been more optimistic about America's future than I am today. And I know I only look like I'm 30, but I've been around a long time.
Net, what do you make of this week for President Biden?
Yeah, I mean, that was a good joke. He had another one. He had another extemporaneous joke in the course of that event that I think went over well about him, somebody stumbling, and it wasn't Joe Biden. He's pretty good at that stuff. On the other hand, the reason he's able to make those jokes is because it's a central part of the discussion that we're having as a country. And one of the reasons that his poll numbers are as low as they are is because not just Republicans are worried about Joe Biden's age. Democrats, 6 in 10 Democrats in the NBC poll, are worried about Joe Biden's age. Look, I think Symone is right when she talks about Democrats currently worrying most about Joe Manchin's exit affecting the Senate count. I think they will come to believe that the more important development is his potential entry into the 2024 presidential campaign. Joe Manchin has been having conversations with no labels and indicated a willingness to run for more than a year. This is not a sort of Johnny-come-lately moment. He's been talking about this. I think he's determined to do it. They may not want him. I think he would like to do it.
Yeah. Well, we will watch that very closely. He's not going to make a decision, I think, for another couple of months. But Tia, pick up on this thread. I mean, I've been talking to Democrats throughout the week in the wake of this polling that we saw, which has former President Trump beating President Biden in 5 key battleground states. They say, look, this is a good thing in a way because we're a year out. This should be a wake-up call to the Biden campaign. They need to get a sharper message on the economy, and they need to start basically viewing this as the general election.
Yeah, I think we heard 2 things from the Biden campaign this week. Number one, a lot of it was, it's a year out. Let's not freak out too much about polling this far from the campaign. But I think we also did hear from Biden campaign officials and Biden surrogates that they do feel like they have a message, and they're trying to figure out how to tailor that message in a way that resonates with their base and different types of voters. And I think even they would say there's work to do there, particularly with younger voters, voters of color. There have been divisions recently with the Israel-Hamas conflict, for example, that demonstrates that it's not easy to bring everyone in. There are complicated decisions that have to be made, and they're still figuring it out, but they think they have time.
Yeah, Symone, what do you think? First of all, what do you make of the poll numbers? Are they a wake-up call, or are they a sign that maybe there should be someone else running? And what do you think the problem is? It his message on the economy? What do you think needs to change?
I think when it comes to the battleground state polling, I do think a year out is way too far to take battleground state polling and say, this is the Bible and we need to do something about this. And so they should look at the polls. Obviously, polls are a snapshot in time, but I do not think this is indicative of where things could potentially be come, October 2024. I do think, though, when it comes to maybe what is not resonating, the Bidenomics situation is, I don't think that they came out of the gate and they said, we're going to brand this thing as Bidenomics. Instead of just telling the people what it is that they're getting. Instead of, people don't understand Bidenomics, and I think that that is part of the issue. And so what you have heard folks like Andy Beshear, governor, who won re-election on Tuesday, do, is he talked about Bidenomics on the campaign trail and when he gave his acceptance speech. But you never heard the word Bidenomics. You heard battery production facilities. You heard roads and bridges. You heard the Brent Spence Bridge, right? Yeah. You heard the president start to do that when he announced the money for Amtrak and rail, talked about what this would mean. Never heard the term Bidenomics. I think just telling the people what they are getting, what is happening, what you have done, they will see more resonance there than a fancy name.
It's so interesting because so many of the Democrats I spoke to are echoing what you're saying, that there needs to be a sharper message, and I think you just put a fine point on it, Symone. Stephen, during the debate this past Wednesday, I pressed the Republican candidates on the issue of abortion in the wake of these losses in Ohio, where abortion was literally on the ballot, where Democrats swept the state legislature, in Virginia, where abortion was in focus. It was an issue in Kentucky as well. And what was notable is that Senator Scott was really the only candidate on stage who had a clear message, which is that he supports a 15-week federal ban. How much of an issue do you think this is? How big of a headwind is it for Republicans heading into 2024?
It's an issue and it's a headwind.
Yeah.
I think you're finding Republicans now sort of finding their way on what language is best to use. Nikki Haley, I thought, actually had a pretty good answer in this debate that was consistent with the answer that she offered last debate, which was more of a pragmatic argument. And it's, this has been an argument inside the Republican Party for a long time, because on the one hand, people who are pro-life out of conviction and out of principle. And so if you believe that abortion is killing an infant, it's hard to make a pragmatic case that this is what. But politics matter here. And I think Republicans are sort of wising up to that and saying, look, we can stay true to the principle and come up with a better way to talk about it and a political, pragmatic way of dealing with it.
Well, and it's a good point. We'll have to see if Haley's message resonates. She talks about consensus, exactly what you're saying. All right, great conversation. Thank you so much. Happy Friday, all.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or follow us on social media.